This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. A jury finds Paul Manafort guilty on 8 charges in his tax and bank fraud case, but the judge declares a mistrial on the remaining counts. In a separate case, the president's former lawyer Michael Cohen admits to violating campaign finance laws in paying off women. He faces years in prison. And can the fastest man in the world get ahead in the world of professional soccer? Usain Bolt thinks so. We'll take a look. Welcome to World News America. We come on air tonight with 2 breaking legal stories regarding former members of President Trump's inner circle. His former campaign manager Paul Manafort's been found guilty on 8 counts in a Virginia court, but the jury couldn't come to a decision on 10 other charges. Meanwhile, in New York, President Trump's former lawyer Michael Cohen has surrendered to the FBI. He pleaded guilty to a number of counts of financial crimes at a federal courthouse. Well, for the latest on this, we can turn to our correspondent, Chris Buckler. Let's start with the Paul Manafort case. What did we learn today? Yes,
Paul Manafort was on charges relating to bank and tax fraud, and he's been found guilty of all 5 counts of tax fraud, as well as being found on 1 guilty of 1 count of failing to disclose a foreign bank account and 2 charges of bank fraud. Now, fundamentally, the jury were deadlocked on a number of other issues. So on 10 charges, they've decided to not come to a verdict, and as a result, the judge has declared a mistrial in those cases. However, Paul Manafort has now been found guilty. It's important to remember that all of these charges do predate his time working for Donald Trump. They actually relate to his time working in Ukraine for pro-Russian politicians and oligarchs there, in which he's alleged to have made tens of millions of dollars and not declared a substantial amount of it. And of course, a lot of the trial itself focused on what he did with that money, spending on expensive property, on expensive items, expensive cars, indeed also clothing. Some mention of, for example, python jackets and ostrich jackets and the like. But he has now been found guilty, and of course the president will be watching this, because throughout this trial he has made comment, often saying that he feels Paul Manafort has been treated somewhat unfairly, but in truth he's now been found guilty.
Let's move to someone else who was close to Donald Trump, and that's his former lawyer Michael Cohen, who surrendered himself to the FBI. What more do we know about that?
Yeah, he has now appeared in court in New York, and again he is facing a number of charges, and he has pleaded guilty in what appears to be a plea deal with the Department of Justice. We'll just go through the counts of those as well. Some of them relate to tax evasion, some of them relate to false statements to a financial institution. But it's counts 7 and 8 that a lot of people will focus on, because this is the willful cause of unlawful corporate contribution and excessive campaign contribution. Now, it seems that these relate to his time working for Donald Trump in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election. And while President Trump has not been mentioned, Michael Cohen said that it was at the direction of a candidate for federal office he arranged to make payments for principal purpose of influence an election. And of course, we do know, for example, that payments were made through him to Stormy Daniels, the porn star who claims that she had a sexual encounter with President Trump.
Chris Buckler, thanks for now. Well, for more on all of this, let's bring Ellie Honig, a former Assistant US Attorney for the Southern District of New York. First of all, let's get your reaction to Michael Cohen's guilty plea.
It's a blockbuster. There's just no 2 ways about it. You know, in particular, counts 7 and 8, which you were just referencing. I mean, we now have an individual who has gone into federal court and pled guilty to federal crimes that directly involve the President of the United States. It's an enormous deal. I think the big question now is he cooperating with the Southern District? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but if he is, then it's even worse news for the President.
Yes, I mean, just that line that Chris mentioned earlier, Ellie, direction of a candidate for federal office. As you say there, a real dig, perhaps, directly at Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear who that unnamed candidate is, and it is sort of standard procedure in the Southern District of New York, where I used to work, which brought this case, not to name people other than the defendant in the indictment. So you'll see things like a candidate or another person, but I don't think there's any question who that other candidate is.
And what does this mean about those payments that were made, that hush money made to Stormy Daniels and potentially to another woman who also claimed to have had an encounter with Donald Trump?
Yeah, so obviously those payments are distasteful and hugely problematic politically. But what this says is they're also illegal because of the timing and the other circumstances around the payments. Those are construed as campaign contributions because they were designed to protect and promote the Trump campaign. And so they were far, far over the legal limits for a campaign donation, and they certainly were not reported. So those are crimes.
And let's just move on to the other blockbuster case today, the verdict in the Paul Manafort trial. What's your reaction to that?
Huge win for the prosecution. Don't let the fact that there was 8 counts of conviction and 10 hung counts, don't misconstrue that for any sort of tie or draw. This is an outright win for the prosecutors, a loss for Paul Manafort. He is looking at hard time in prison now because of this conviction.
And what might this mean to the wider investigation legally?
First of all, it's a great sort of notch in the belt for Mueller. I think it will promote the legitimacy of what he's doing. I think it will really undermine the president's continued refrain of rigged witch hunt and, this is all rigged. We've now had an impartial jury that has obviously very carefully gone through this and found that Manafort committed these crimes. And I guess the big question is, what happens next? Does the president pardon Manafort, which I think is a possibility, or does Manafort cooperate, which is also a possibility? So we have an interesting sort of showdown looming here.
And just looking at both of these cases today, I mean, what does this mean overall for the president now?
It's a bad day for the president. We've just had his longtime attorney and his one-time campaign manager convicted of very serious federal crimes. So it's just going to increase the pressure and the temperature on the president.
Elie Honig, thanks very much for joining us.
Anytime, thank you.
Now, Microsoft says it's blocked attempts by Russia to hack conservative groups here in the US. Last week, the tech giant shut down 6 internet sites that the company claims were trying to steal data from political organizations like the US Senate and a Republican think tank. The Kremlin was quick to dismiss the claims, saying, "We don't know what hackers they are talking about." Well, for more on this, I spoke earlier with Brad Smith, the president and chief legal officer at Microsoft. Brad Smith, very good to have you with us. Is there any doubt that Russia is behind this?
Well, there is no doubt in our minds that these 6 sites that we disrupted last week were put up by a group called Strontium or Fancy Bear, a group that is widely associated with the Russian government.
And tell us a bit about these groups.
Well, what we have seen in recent years, and this group in particular, is a variety of tactics, but oftentimes the creation of these kind of fake internet sites that then are used to seek to hack into and download emails from, say, political campaigns or candidates or other political organizations. We saw it, the focus of attack in the United States in the 2016 presidential election. We saw it across the board in the French presidential election last year. We're seeing this again in 2018, and we're seeing it not just against Democrats, but in this instance, 2 think tanks that are more commonly associated with Republicans. We're seeing it with a variety of domains that are clearly focused on the members of the United States Senate.
Russia is accusing your company, Microsoft, of a witch hunt, saying that they are not behind this.
For us, the facts are clear. We have been able to transfer control of these websites to our digital crimes unit. We're 100% certain that these are associated with this Strontium or Fancy Bear group. We have no doubts.
Now, Mr. Smith, you've been saying that you've been dealing with this since the 2016 election. What are you doing to counter these threats, especially as we go into another set of elections?
Today, we're launching an account guard initiative that really will focus first in the United States, but ultimately around the world, to better protect political candidates and campaigns and parties and think tanks, to strengthen their email protection, really to provide our best threat intelligence information, the kinds of information we share with our large enterprise customers, so that at no additional charge, political campaigns can benefit from this protection as well. This is one example of the kinds of proactive steps that we believe are going to be needed, not just by Microsoft, but across the tech sector and increasingly in partnership between the tech sector and with democratic governments around the world.
How much of a challenge is it to stay one step ahead of these hackers?
I think we have to recognize that there is a constant challenge involved here. We are getting smarter, we are innovating, so is the other side. This is not going to stop, at least for the foreseeable future. Fundamentally, protection of democracy in the 21st century really requires that those of us in the tech sector focus on innovating in these new ways and collaborating in these new ways with people in governments around the world.
Brad Smith from Microsoft, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the day's other news. A 95-year-old former Nazi concentration camp guard arrived in Germany after a long deportation battle in the US. Yakiv Pali's been stateless since a federal judge revoked his US citizenship in 2003. Immigration and customs agents finally implemented a deportation order against him dating back to 2004. The US ambassador to Germany said the deportation came after months of diplomatic negotiations. US First Lady Melania Trump will travel to Africa later this year on her first major solo trip. The details of which countries she'll visit haven't been released. The president has yet to visit the African continent since taking office. He was criticised for allegedly referring to some countries there using disparaging and offensive language. At least 10 hikers have been killed after flash flooding in southern Italy. They were walking in a gorge in a national park on the Catalonia region when they were hit by a wall of water following heavy rain. Officials say 23 people have been rescued. Let's go back to our top story, the guilty verdicts for Donald Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, and his former lawyer, Michael Cohen. Well, for more on all of that, let's bring in our North America editor, John Sopel. John, let's start with Michael Cohen. How staggering is what he's pleaded guilty to?
Rajini, sorry, it's very noisy down on the street. So let's just deal with, first of all, Michael Cohen and what happened in court today. Now, Michael Cohen, of course, was Donald Trump's longtime Mr. Fix-It, his personal lawyer. And today he surrendered himself to the FBI. He's made a plea deal with the federal authorities that in return for pleading guilty, he will get a slightly lesser sentence. It looks like it's going to be something like 5 years. Now, what we didn't know, whether it would be purely about a fraud case that is related to a taxi business, or whether it would impinge on his activities working for Donald Trump during the presidential campaign, and it certainly does. In court today, he said that he broke campaign law in coordination with and at the direction of the candidate for a federal office. Now, he doesn't name Donald Trump, but he doesn't really need to. It's clear that who he is saying that he broke the campaign finance laws for, and that, of course, is in connection with the payment to Stormy Daniels, a woman who alleged that she had a relationship with Donald Trump, and to someone else who was a former playmate. Now, Donald Trump has always insisted he knew nothing of this. This puts him in an awkward position, and Michael Cohen was the man who for many years was paid to make Donald Trump's problems go away. Well, today he could be one of his biggest problems.
And John, there are more problems potentially for the president. Someone else who was very close to him, Paul Manafort, found guilty on a number of charges today as well at a court in Virginia. What's your take on that?
Rajini, it's hard to overstate just what an extraordinary last hour we've had, because almost simultaneously we had Michael Cohen pleading guilty to 8 charges in a New York court, while Paul Manafort, the former campaign manager in the lead up to the election, was found guilty of 8 counts in a courtroom in Alexandria for tax fraud. Now, this doesn't relate to activities that took place during the campaign itself. It all predates that. But it also goes to the heart of something else which is difficult for Donald Trump, and that is Paul Manafort's relations with pro-Russian Ukrainians. And of course, Donald Trump has faced these charges that his whole policy towards Russia had changed, and that there was there's a special counsel investigation going on into whether there was collusion between the Trump campaign and Donald Trump. And so today we have Paul Manafort being found guilty, his former lawyer Michael Cohen pleading guilty. It doesn't come much more jaw-dropping than that.
Indeed, John. John Sopel, thanks very much. You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme, keeping faithful to their president. Why white evangelicals in Tennessee think Donald Trump's doing such a good job. Fightings erupted in the Afghan capital, Kabul, after the presidential palace was attacked by suspected militants. It happened as the country's president was making a televised speech at a ceremony. Our correspondent Shoaib Sharifi has the latest.
Kabul had a turbulent day. Millions of people were preparing to celebrate Eid al-Adha, and the most important festival of the year in Afghanistan was disturbed by explosions of mortar on the most important and highly fortified part of Kabul, the vicinity of Presidential Palace and diplomatic enclave. This was followed by an attack when assailants managed to break through various security barriers and reached almost at the doorsteps of Afghan Ministry of Defense, and it took Afghan police and army almost 4 hours using ground as well as air support, the helicopters, to end this attack.
Even the world's best athletes need a new challenge from time to time. He's already broken world records and won a haul of medals as a runner, but now Usain Bolt's ready for something new. The 8-time Olympic champion's begun training with an Australian football team, a move which has raised more than a few eyebrows. He's hoping to earn a place on the local squad, but critics say it's little more than a publicity stunt, as Hywel Griffiths reports.
He may be the fastest man in the world, but Usain Bolt has a lot of catching up to do if he really is to become a professional footballer. Today is his 32nd birthday, an age when some players start to think about retirement. But Bolt says playing professionally has been a lifelong dream, which he's determined to achieve.
Football has always been something that is a passion of mine that I enjoy. Even when my coach at a professional level would say, "You're saying don't play football, you can't be playing football in the middle of the season," I still would play because I enjoy, it's something that I enjoy. So now that I've retired and I had the opportunity to play with the top team and to show what I can do, something I want to do, I want to challenge myself.
No one can doubt his athletic ability. Still the world record holder at 100 and 200 metres, he retired last year as the finest sportsman of his generation. Since then, he's trained with football teams in Germany, Norway and South Africa. But so far, no one has offered him a professional contract.
If this is just a big PR stunt to bring attention to Australia's A-League, then it's already worked. But if it's to have a more lasting impact, Usain Bolt needs to prove his worth not just in sponsorship and advertising, but as part of a team.
His star power could help lift the Mariners, who finished bottom of the league last year, and it will definitely help bring new fans to their games.
I think it's great. He's going to be fantastic.
Will it make you watch the football?
Well, I already have a daughter who's in the football, so she will be very keen to watch him too.
I'm going to get my little daughter a Usain Bolt jersey as soon as it's available. So
it's working then, you're going to buy the merchandise?
Absolutely, I haven't bought a Mariners jersey yet, so no, definitely looking forward to it.
When it came to today's practice match, Bolt stuck to the sidelines. No one knows yet if or when he'll actually play. Manchester United's former assistant manager Mike Phelan is the sporting director here.
He's coming into the game, late, but a dream's a dream at the end of the day, and he's ambitious, he's charismatic, and what he has done is he's brought attention to the coast.
Whether this is the start of a new career or just a diversion, Usain Bolt has already left his mark on Australia. Hywel Griffiths, BBC News on the Central Coast.
Now back to politics, and against the backdrop of those two legal verdicts we were talking about earlier, Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen, President Trump is about to hold a rally in West Virginia this evening as he steps up his support for Republican candidates in the midterm elections. It's a chance for him to connect with his base ahead of those elections in November. Our correspondent Nick Bryant travelled to the state of Tennessee to test the pulse of evangelical voters who backed Mr. Trump in large numbers in 2016.
It wasn't just the post-industrial landscape of the Rust Belt that provided lush political terrain for Donald Trump, but the Southern Bible Belt as well.
Good morning.
Congregations such as the Thousand Hills Cowboy Church in central Tennessee.
Gravy and biscuits, beef, bacon, sausage, all of it.
White evangelicals who in the presidential election gave the New York billionaire a higher level of support than Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush.
We like somebody that'll just say what's on their mind, speak whatever it is you want to say, and say it as plain spoken as you can.
I don't agree with some of the words he uses, but he's doing more than any of the presidents that have done in the past.
You think he's one of the truly great presidents?
I really do. I think he's going to be.
His behaviour, a lot of people think, isn't that Christian.
Well, as Christians, we all fail. That's why we need Jesus Christ in our lives.
Many white evangelicals feel besieged and isolated in what they fear is becoming an increasingly godless America. Many also feel sneered at by East and West Coast elites, a grievance shared by Donald Trump. There's a mutual sense of victimhood that the president has exploited.
I can't imagine anything any better. You know, a good rodeo and a good clown and having a good time.
On policy too, Pastor Bill Adams says that Trump's support for gun rights and his zero-tolerance approach to immigration resonates in these churches too.
And it's a very tough situation to jail. You know, mamas and daddies and babies are left here. It's a tough situation.
But you don't blame Donald Trump?
I don't blame Donald Trump. I blame mamas and daddies that chose to come to this country illegally.
Evangelicals have become more right-wing over the past 50 years, partly because the gospel of prosperity has been preached in so many megachurches across the country. The former property tycoon is a beneficiary of that trend. The evangelical movement has always liked a showman, charismatic speakers with star power on TV. But it isn't just what Donald Trump is, it's what he isn't. A Democrat pushing a socially liberal agenda.
I like Trump of his boldness, of him not being scared to speak what he thinks.
It's what he sees as the moral wreckage of a permissive America that concerns junkyard owner David Kersey. It's important to preserve the right-wing majority on the US Supreme Court. And for social conservatives, a former playboy is delivering precisely that.
Even the American people in Tennessee had rather have a person in the White House that may be a womanizer versus a person in the White House that upholds for gay marriages.
The issue of gay marriage is that important here?
You know, if you're going to have to pick one of the two, I think they're going to pick the womanizer.
White evangelicals used to be the demographic most likely to believe a politician's private immorality would impact their behavior in public life. Polling now shows they're the demographic least likely to think that. They've become more forgiving since the advent of Donald Trump. Nick Bryant, BBC News, Tennessee.
Well, despite that snapshot of support for the president, there are many questions today about those who've worked for him in the past. Well, for more on the Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen legal results, I'm joined by our North America reporter, Anthony Zerka. Let's start with Michael Cohen. He gave himself up to the FBI and effectively all but named the president as well.
Exactly. He pled guilty to 8 counts, 8 criminal charges, 5 of which were related to tax evasion. 1 was about lying to a financial institution. The key is there were 2 counts that directly involved campaign finance violations. He said that he made payments to women, Stormy Daniels, Karen McDougal, on behalf and at the direction of the candidate, Donald Trump, in order to help him be elected president, to obtain their silence when they were going to allege that they had affairs with Donald Trump right up until the presidential election in 2016.
So how worried are they likely to be at the White House now that they've heard this?
I think they have to be very worried. Donald Trump tweeted back in July that that Cohen might plead guilty in order to get himself out of an unrelated jam. Well, this was a very related jam. This was involvement in the presidential campaign, and he's admitting illegality. And more than that, he's admitting illegal campaign contributions that were at the request of Donald Trump himself. He said the candidate, but it's clear who he was talking about. So this gets all of those campaign questions, campaign contribution, campaign finance questions very much front and center. Donald Trump had said time and time again he didn't know about those payments ahead of time.
And we've heard that Paul Manafort's lawyer has said that Mr. Manafort is disappointed with the verdict there. Throughout the trial, Donald Trump was saying what a great man Paul Manafort was.
Right, and they would be disappointed. They wanted this trial in Virginia. They wanted 2 trials. There's a second one in D.C. next month because they thought they might get a better jury, they might get a speedier trial, might be easier to get, if not an acquittal, a hung jury. They didn't get that. 8 out of the 18 charges were guilty, including 5 felony tax evasion charges. So if you think that Mueller wanted to bring this case against Paul Manafort, that does not directly relate to the campaign, but get convictions, put pressure on Paul Manafort to cooperate with the heart of the investigation into possible Russian ties to the Trump campaign. That mission has been accomplished. That objective has been achieved. They have a conviction. Manafort is now facing prison sentences. He's got more trials coming up. This could be bad news for Donald Trump, and he has essentially put himself on the line defending Paul Manafort in the past few days.
And just briefly, what will Robert Mueller be thinking today looking at these 2 results?
Well, it's a win on the Manafort case. They needed that. It would have been highly embarrassing if he had lost. With Cohen, we'll have to see if Cohen cooperates. There was no direct cooperation agreement in this plea deal, but he, facing 5 years in prison, could decide to work with Mueller's team.
Anthony Zerka, thanks very much for the latest on that. Well, you can find more on those 2 news stories on our website. You can also find me on Twitter at BBC Rajini V. I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. Thanks very much for watching us here at BBC World News America.